Great. So thank you everybody for coming. This is mostly a web event, but we are thrilled to have our Summer Honors Program students with us today, and we're also thrilled to have Chairwoman Virginia Foxx with us today to talk about campus anti-Semitism, for or against. No, that's not quite the topic of conversation, but I don't really want to give a long lead into the topic of campus anti-Semitism because I think we are all, at this point, all too familiar with it, what it is, how it manifests itself, and how colleges have responded to it. One of, I think, the very fortunate and blessed things about living in a democratic republic, though, is that one of the reasons we're so familiar with it is the work that Chairwoman Foxx and her committee has done on this. I think it's come as a very pleasant surprise to very many people to see how the U.S. House of Representatives has responded to this kind of rolling moral crises on our campus. So just thrilled to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you very much, Max. I'm delighted. But I thought it was going to be a small group, but you've got all these honor scholars here, so you've really put me on the spot today. Oh, I do want to introduce somebody who's with me who works with the committee. Ari Wish is over here. Ari Wish, excuse me. And Ari has been doing a lot of the work behind the scenes. As some of you may know, we have wonderful staffers on all our committees. I happen to believe that the Education and Workforce Committee have the best staff. And Ari's been doing a fantastic job of helping with a lot of the things, and Nick Barley's right behind him, too. So Nick works with the committee in the communications area.
No, thrilled with the work that they're doing on my behalf and on behalf of many Americans, Jews and Gentiles, just thrilled with what you guys have done. And so that's kind of where I want to start on that, right? I think the hearings with Harvard, Penn, MIT, they came as a shock to a lot of Americans, right? And you have put together many a hearing in your day. Most hearings, as I understand them, are kind of friendly affairs, right? You pick your witnesses, you kind of know what they're going to say. This one, I don't know how much you guys knew or expected or what you thought going into it. So I'm just curious, like, to pull the curtain back a little bit to what you expected before, how you planned around it, and some of your impressions as that kind of iconic set of hearings unfolded.
Well, the first thing I would say is right after October 8th, we know what happened on October 7th, starting on October 8th, there were these, quote, spontaneous demonstrations on campuses. And pretty soon we decided with the staff and I that something needed to be done to put a spotlight on what was happening on the campuses. And we thought the three campuses, there were a lot of contestants for the three worst campuses, but normally when we have a hearing, you have three witnesses on the majority side, one on the minority side. So we decided we'd start with Harvard, UPenn, and MIT because there were a lot of bad things happening on those campuses. But as you've seen, we've talked to other campuses too. We brought Columbia on, and then we're doing transcribed interviews with other campuses. And then we had last week Northwestern and Rutgers and UCLA. So anyway, we contacted the presidents, and we were really surprised that they agreed to come so easily. But we prepared for the hearing in the same way that we normally prepare for a hearing. A lot of research, a lot of memos going back and forth among the staff and with me. So we really didn't know exactly what to expect from the hearings. We did not talk to the presidents in advance to say, here are some of the questions we may be asking you. They asked to talk with me before the hearing. And so two of them came in at one time, Claudine Gay, and I think it was the MIT president who came in with her. And we just chit-chatted for just a little bit. And then Claudine Gay said to me, Madam Chair, what is your vision for this hearing? Which I thought was kind of an interesting way to phrase it. What's my vision for the hearing? And I said, well, my vision is that you get a spine and that you call out the moral rot that's going on.
So it didn't go as you expected.
Right. And then the other president came in, and I said basically the same thing. You know, I grew up in the country, and I use sometimes very plain language with people, but that's sort of what I said to them, and hoped that they would take my advice.
Yeah.
But they didn't.
No, they did not acquit themselves particularly well, I think it's safe to say.
Right.
And I think that, I think most Americans who are watching it or observed it, refracted through Twitter, they were astonished at how poorly they did. But I also think there's a sense of just astonishment at, like, what is this? Where did it all come from, right? So I'm curious, when you talk to the constituent and you have the quick version, what's your quick diagnosis for this has come from, and what's your kind of longer for an AEI, some honors student crowd diagnosis of how everything so spontaneously happened on campuses?
Well, I actually have a couple of quotes that I would give you, but again, in just paraphrasing, I have said to people, this has been going on for a long time. And there was an article that I did want to call to your attention that came out, I can't remember exactly what day it was, but it was an article written by Joe Engel, November, in the Wall Street Journal, that I think that you all might be interested in if you missed it. But I have a quote from Schumer that I think is good. That and I did this in my opening statement for the hearing, and I'd like to read it so I make sure I get it clear. I said, who better to explain the situation than the most prominent Jewish Democrat? In a floor speech, he said, many of the people who express these sentiments in America aren't neo-Nazis or card-carrying Klan members or Islamist extremists. They're in many cases people that most liberal Jewish Americans felt previously were their ideological fellow travelers. Not long ago, many of us marched together for black and brown lives. And that's what Joe Engel talks about in his article, that this has been around for a long time, but it didn't manifest itself. The anti-Semitism was kind of hidden. And in his article, Joe Engel uses a couple of examples that happened to him in his life where it sort of took him by surprise, and now he sees what was underlying behavior that he had not recognized or come to grips with.
Yeah. So, it's been very notable how, inarticulate many of these protesters have been when they've been put to it. But to the extent that they've had kind of defenders in the public square, they don't really defend the phenomenon in itself as much as they will kind of use one or two buzzwords to run interference for it, right? And the first buzzword is academic freedom. And there's this concern, you see it over and over again in education trade press, that what Chairwoman Foxx are doing, what Elise Stefanik are doing, what Congress is doing, what state legislatures might start doing, this imposes on academic freedom. So, what is your argument for, or what is your counter to that, or how do you think about academic freedom and the role that democratic oversight plays in universities?
Well, I think it's a favorite trope of the people in the universities is, no, you can't look at what we do here. You can't hold us accountable, because then you're impinging on academic freedom. Well, look, the American people are pouring billions of dollars every year into these institutions. And yes, we have a right to hold them accountable for how the money is being spent. And there's a difference between free speech and anti-Semitism, a huge difference between the two ideologies. Anti-Semitism is not acceptable under academic freedom. That is totally different from free speech. And so basically, I think what the postsecondary institutions, see, I don't call them institutions of higher education anymore. Because, and I've been saying this for several years, I use the term post-secondary because I don't think they're teaching higher order skills. And I think for you to call them institutions of higher education, they should be teaching higher order skills, and I don't think they are. So what the institutions of post-secondary education want is just give them all the money in the world that they ask for and leave them alone. And then if you do try to hold them accountable, they'll scream academic freedom.
Yeah. And in answering that, you touched on my next question, right, which is that the other defense is it's either academic freedom or it's freedom of speech, right? And this is what Claudine Gay got so famously tripped up over, and her line was, well, when speech rolls into conduct, that was the best that she could do to answer this question of how do we square one imperative for free speech and another imperative for this kind of speech. What's your answer to that? What would you have said if you were her, or what would you say to that?
Well, I think that in many cases, neither professors nor students understand what it is, what free speech is, because they're not learning the concept of free speech. And we've actually introduced a bill on free speech issues. Congressman Brandon Williams, and I can't remember numbers of bills, so you got to, let me look at the numbers here. It's H.R. 7683, respecting the First Amendment on campus. And what we're trying to do is make sure that campuses do a better job of understanding, having students understand what their rights are under the Constitution in terms of free speech, and what the restraints are on the colleges and universities when they try to constrain free speech. And it's a very good bill, not a really long bill, but something that I'd encourage you to read, 7683, Respecting the First Amendment on Campus Act.
Yeah. So, I mean, in addition to the hearings, you guys did something as a committee that I found very heartening on the one hand and a little bit disturbing on the other, which is you released a really excellent in-depth report of the anti-Semitism and its various manifestations, right? Not just the encampments, but going back kind of years, discerning a pattern at Harvard University. And I couldn't help but think when I was reading that this is the kind of thing I could imagine reading from the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. And I could imagine reading it in the context of either an enforcement letter forcing them to change, or maybe even in a letter saying you have violated Title VI so systematically that you are no longer receiving Title IV federal funds. We haven't really seen anything like that from the Biden administration, so I'm just curious for your general comment as to the Biden administration's executive enforcement, non-enforcement of civil rights protections on this front.
Right. Before I answer that question, let me say that most of the condemning words in that report came from Harvard faculty who were on the academic advisory committee. I'm not sure I can remember the exact, but it was appointed by Claudine Gay to look at the accusations of anti-Semitism on the campus, and they actually gave her that report before she came and testified to our committee, but they ignored it. So that's another very, very telling thing that for those of you, I don't know, and again, you're honor scholars here. So my guess, how many of you have ever served on an advisory committee on campus? A few of you? Have you known the administration to follow many of the recommendations of the advisory committee? Because another favorite thing that top administrators do on campuses, of course, is they appoint committees. They're really great at appointing committees and having the committees do reports and patting them on the head and saying thank you very much and then not doing anything. Now, back to your original question is, yes, you would think that the Biden Education Department would have seized on this report and pushed up the complaints from students at Harvard to the top of the list. Their argument, Secretary Cardona's argument is they don't have enough people or enough money to do the kind of investigations that need to be done of all these complaints that they're getting. But when you said it was a disturbing report, that's the word you used. It was a good report, but a disturbing report. It's really heartrending report. It really is heartrending. And I have read bits and pieces from other campuses that have people where we've gotten information, particularly from students, and it really breaks your heart to see what these students have gone through on these campuses, and administrators ignore them time after time after time. But you're exactly right. This should have been at the top of their list. They should have gotten onto it immediately. I mean, we've done the work for them, basically. We've done the work for them. And they are, again, just like Claudine Gay, they're ignoring the clear evidence of the anti-Semitism that's on the campus. And again, it goes beyond even, it's not just the feeling of anti-Semitism, it's terrible actions taken against students. Students being spat upon, students being pushed, students having their jewelry taken away from them, those kinds of things. It's real physical action in addition to attitude.
Yeah. You know, for my part, I'm a bit skeptical that it's a resource issue on the Biden Department of Education's front.
You don't mean it.
A little skeptical.
You don't.
They have time for other things, it seems. Another person who is slightly, I think, skeptical of the Biden administration's approach is President Trump, who has said, in so many words, if I were president right now, these would be shut down. And it's my sense that if he were, the federal government would have taken a very different tack towards it. And it's also my sense that a lot of people in academia might not be properly pricing in how likely it is that he will be, and certainly aren't adequately anticipating what that might mean for them. So obviously you don't speak on his behalf by any means, but what do you think that college presidents can expect from what's already happened, from what might continue to happen, if there is a change in presidency and they're operating under a Republican Office of Civil Rights, Republican executive?
I'm a little skeptical of whether the presidents of many of these institutions will take any different kind of action than what they're taking now. I think they'll rant and rave. I think they'll scream things like, academic freedom. I think they'll say, but look over here at these other kinds of things. I'd like to believe that just as a result of what we've done already, you're going to see major changes on campuses. I'd like to see that happen. Maybe there'll be some changes on the schools we've highlighted, but even there, I don't expect a lot. But you're right, I don't speak for President Trump. I know that he has expressed to me at one time that he didn't think the federal government should be involved in education at all. And I emphasized that to him and said, yes, sir, the word education is not in the Constitution as a responsibility of the federal government. That is my position. However, I am not in charge. If I were, I'd get us out of education in a heartbeat. But I'm not in charge. So I would like to believe that you would see a diminished role of the federal government in post-secondary education and even in K through 12. The president, I think, is really repelled by any kind of anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit, one thing that always comes up in these conversations, one way or the other, is this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? And it's been funny watching these debates unfold because it's clear this is a term that the left took to put all sorts of things inside of it, on the one hand. On the other hand, at this point, the right is kind of taking it as a shorthand for whatever whatever we don't like is DEI's fault, right? So I'm curious, just for your perspective, what you think the relationship is between DEI, the DEI apparatus on campus, and what we've seen with campus anti-Semitism.
Well, first I'll say, the left is great at appropriating language. Who doesn't like diversity, equity, and inclusion? Those words sound terrific until you peel them back as to what they really mean. And I think the words have come to mean differently from what most people want them to mean. Again, yes, taken on their face, you want a diverse population, you want people treated equitably. Now, I know that's not what they mean by equity, but that's what most people hear when they hear that term equity. They think being treated equitably, not equal outcomes. But I think what it has really done is divide people into two groups of people. You're either oppressed or you're an oppressor. And I think that's what they have done with those words. And so it's really troubling how words get distorted again from what people who are not, quote, on the inside, are not a part of the group that's using those words for nefarious purposes, what they think they mean and what the others think they mean.
Yeah. So just to go off that a little bit more, back when I was at the Manhattan Institute, one of my great colleagues there was a gentleman named Coleman Hughes, who was a relatively recent Columbia grad, and I still follow his work closely. He made an interesting observation that when he was at Columbia within the past decade, he didn't witness anything that he thought was, anti-Semitic in a classical sense, right? You would not see a student just making a casual statement deriding Jews. But what he would see is he would see students making casual statements deriding white people.
Right.
And the observation that he made was it seems as though there is, under the banner of DEI, a blanket idea of anti-whiteness, which
Correct.
has this kind of oppressor-oppressed dynamic you're saying, and then the anti-Semitism was kind of just plugged and chugged into that. So I'm curious for just a little bit more of your perspective on the relationship between this idea of anti-whiteness and anti-Semitism, and also, the question a lot of people have of, well, are our politicians only taking an interest in it now? I mean, what is it about, should there have been more proactive enforcement against the anti-whiteness years ago? How do you think about just the relationship between these ideas and how they've manifested?
No, I think he's onto something in talking about that, and I think that has taken hold in much of what is happening. And I think that Jewish people have been caught up into this because they are considered a part of the European white culture, and therefore they're a part of that.
Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, and then I want to throw it open to the room for the duration. One thing we've heard a lot about is kind of foreign funding on campus, right? And so, just to take one idea, it turns out Northwestern University takes quite a bit of money from Qatar. One can speculate as to whether or not this had something to do with why President Michael Schill decided that October 7th was a great time to stop making political statements. But I feel as though there's a little bit of daylight between that and what actually happens. I think people, they see that there's foreign money, they see that these universities act this way, but it's not necessarily clear to me or clear to other people, well, how and why does that money matter, and what can be done about it, or what should be done on it from a federal or even a state level?
Well, we're onto it.
Yeah.
We actually got onto it. It actually started happening during the Trump administration. Under the Trump administration, Secretary DeVos noted that the colleges and universities were not abiding by, I think it's Section 217, is that right? Section 217 of the Higher Education Act. by reporting foreign gifts. And so she started asking the colleges and universities for better reports because they basically weren't getting anything in from them. And so we decided that the Foreign Gifts Act or Section 217 needed to be updated. And so we have passed a bill out of the House called the Deterrent Act, because we're very concerned with what impact foreign money can have on institutions. And you're right, I think the amount of money that Northwestern has gotten is like $600 million
I think,
from Qatar. Now, most people don't give away or even most countries don't give away $600 million without expecting something in return. Let me say a little bit of something about the Deterrent Act first. What we've done in that bill is we've taken the amounts down. And again, we had, I think it was like $250,000 that the colleges and universities had to report. Now we're saying zero. You got to report everything, basically, or most every. From certain countries, you've got to report zero. From other countries, a much smaller amount. And I can't remember exactly what those are, so I better not quote myself. But now we're saying we want to know before it was just the money coming to the universities. So now we're saying what's coming into the universities, what's coming into the departments, what's coming into institutes, what's coming into individual faculty members. So we're going down into the institution to say we need to know what kind of money you're getting, where is it going, and ultimately what will be the purpose of this money. And again, we think the American people have a right to know. Maybe there's nothing nefarious about it, okay? So we'll start out everybody's innocent until proven guilty. That's a philosophy of our country. But it'll be up to the colleges and universities to tell us what the money is, and then maybe other people will ask more questions about it.
Yeah, I mean, so that seems like a hard thing. I mean, it seems like a very good idea, a very straightforward idea, very sensible, kind of a hard thing to be against. But I suspect that there might be some people who are against it.
Well, we had 31 Democrats vote for the bill. It's in the Senate. So hopefully Senator Schumer will find some time to be able to bring it up for a vote. I think it should pass in the Senate, and it would be great, and I would love to see President Biden sign it.
Great. And so then the last question before I throw it open, let's say President Trump wins, Republicans get both houses. What else is on your agenda or the Congressional Republicans' agenda on this front? I mean, I think you've said correctly that your actions to date will influence a lot of institutional change, but are there things on a wish list for you? What else kind of do you think, I mean, granted, federal government should have some circumscribed role, but what else do you think might need to be done?
Well, there's a lot on our wish list. We have the College Cost Reduction Act. I now have 115 co-sponsors for that bill. That's pretty remarkable for a bill coming out of sleepy committee like education. We don't get those kinds of co-sponsorships for bills out of our committee. That would really bring transparency and accountability to post-secondary education. We're very excited about that. We have several other bills that we're working on. I should say something about, we're all emphasizing here education, obviously. That's the first name and the title of our committee. We really should be called the HELP Committee, just like the Senate Committee is. The Senate Committee is Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. But our committee has a much broader portfolio than most people know. So we're working not only on education issues, but we work on health issues. We passed a great piece of legislation embedded in some other legislation called the No Surprises Act to get people not to get surprise billing. We're still working through the rules on that bill. So we do, every employer every employee in this country who's covered by employer health care comes under our committee. That's 150 million people in the country. So we have jurisdiction over ERISA, which is in our committee. We also have all labor legislation in our committee. We have OSHA as well as the Labor Department, and we have pensions. But not very many people pay attention, again, to those kinds of things. But we have a lot of things in all of those areas that we're working on in the committee. I'm very realistic about the hopes of getting things passed during this session of Congress. We've passed the Parents' Bill of Rights out of our committee. We've passed the Protecting Women and Girls in Sports Act out of the committee and out of the House. But we're still waiting for the Senate to pass those. And people say all the time, well, the Senate won't pass them. And I say, well, if they're not in the Senate, they can't be passed. So let's pass them out of the House. So we are hoping for more people in the House, and certainly a Republican Senate and a Republican president. And we're all teed up for lots of things. Anything that doesn't get passed in this session, we'll be ready for next session.
Fantastic. All right, and with that, we will segue to our audience Q&A. We here at AA Education have one simple rule about asking a question, or I guess a couple-part rule. One, identify yourself, give your name, your institute, and ask a question. It's fine if you have a little something to say, but if I don't hear a question within a couple of sentences, I will aggressively prompt you to ask. So,
Max, before you
yes.
let's recognize, I want to mention one other thing. I wrote this down. Today, there is a fantastic article in the Wall Street Journal called The Long View of Higher Education Decline.
I haven't got that.
By a man named Vera Derejan.
Oh, yeah, he's a fellow here.
Okay. It's an interview with Harvey Mansfield at Harvard, so I would recommend it to all of you to read. I wanted to be sure to pass it along. I don't always get to read all my clips until several days later, but that caught my eye this morning, and I'm just a huge fan of his.
Yeah, both Duncan and Professor Mansfield are always worth reading because that's absolutely self-recommending. So questions?
Hello, my name is Jackson Kinsella. I'm a student at Stanford University, and I just wanted to thank you for the work you're doing to counter anti-Semitism on our college campuses. I had a broader question, though. What should the consequences be for these protesters who are engaging in this really severe anti-Semitic language? For instance, should foreign students on visas have their visas revoked? Do you think that would be an appropriate step? What is Congress's role in establishing consequences for these protesters? Do you mind expanding upon that a little bit?
Well, that's a really good question. As you may have heard, Speaker Johnson has made this issue a whole of Congress issue. So there are 6 committees that are looking at the anti-Semitism on the campuses, and different committees have different jurisdictions. So for example, visas for foreign students who've engaged in these activities, that would come under the Judiciary Committee, I believe. And so it's up to the Judiciary Committee to come up with some recommendations on that. Tax-exempt status for the campuses themselves. But we're looking at all of these issues, all of us are looking at it. One of the most frustrating things that we found from our hearings is that the campuses don't have very strong behavior codes. So, when we've pressed them on, well, what are you going to do to these students? Well, the deans have responsibility, and then this dean has a responsibility. It's so amorphous that it's very difficult to pin down who's going to take care of them. At our hearing, the last hearing, both Rutgers and Northwestern promised that they're going to spend the summer coming up with clearer conduct codes. So if nothing else comes out of the hearings, maybe good conduct codes will come out. So much of it needs to be done on the campuses. Now, obviously, if we find that or if the Department of Education finds that Title VI has been violated, then they could lose their Title IV money, but that's a ways away, I'm afraid. But yes, we like to see much clearer lines of responsibility and much clearer sanctions on faculty, on students, on staff, because all three groups have been involved. And honestly, the universities just don't have good, clear codes of conduct.
Hi, this is Nikki Neely from Parents Defending Education. In the wake of the attacks, President Biden put a Band-Aid on Title VI, and they expanded their interpretation of that to include shared ancestry. For Title VI, they said shared ancestry would apply for Title VI investigations. Yet they have delayed for 2 years actually expanding Title VI to include things like that. Do you see any movement on that going forward at any point?
Oh, I think if we get a Republican administration, yes. I don't expect the Biden administration to do much, particularly between now and November. They don't want to upset their far left base. They just do not want to do that. So the more they can drag their feet, or the more it can drag its feet, it will do that.
Hi, my name is Thaddeus Burson. I'm a student at Cedarville University. Oversight and accountability is a really good thing, but how do you conduct oversight in such a way that it doesn't set a precedent of extensive government intervention on campuses? For example, I can imagine a scenario where the House flips and your committee starts investigating maybe religious schools for discrimination based on a traditional view of gender.
You've raised a really, really good point. We are extraordinarily careful into how we write legislation and to where we go, because you're exactly right. What we try to do is be even-handed with what we're doing, and of course, most of our oversight will be done with public schools, although there will be oversight in private schools too. But you are exactly right. We have to be super careful that we do not give the other side an excuse for some kind of retribution against people. Oversight is our responsibility as in Congress. It may be as important, particularly for committees like the Education Committee. We're not appropriators, we're policymakers. And so we do the oversight not only of legislation we pass or we introduce and cause to be passed, as well as how money is spent. And so that we have almost a dual responsibility. Now, the approach people can do the same thing, but they don't do as much of it as we're, but that is a really good question.
Thank you. My name is Riley Bryan. I'm an intern here at AEI, and I just
Lucky for you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you a quick question. I know that a lot of these incidents that have been happening on campus have spiraled into incidents where administration has had to make the tough call to bring in local police departments and other sorts of forces of that nature. And I was just wondering to hear your thoughts on the role you believe that the local police departments can play in helping administrations to manage overly ruly situations that might be happening, or outsiders coming into campuses that might not otherwise have a place on these demonstrations.
Well, you know, that was a huge issue for Columbia. Columbia had, I think, had not had police on its campus for many, many, many years. And that was one of the things that the president of Columbia did not want to do. And that was one of the, I guess, points that aggravated the students and the agitators there. I think, again, that's something that the institutions need to develop policies on, not for us to dictate. Again, I go back, I think the less the federal government does in dictating any kind of behavior or policies, the better off we are. but we are going to hold people accountable for spending taxpayer dollars and doing the right thing. And most of the time, we know what doing the right thing is. I often tell people we really don't need much more than the 10 Commandments. If we just did obey, if we just, everything behavior we have basically falls within those 10 Commandments. And we know the difference. You know, there's a piece written many years ago. I learned everything I need to know in kindergarten, right? You know what's the right thing to do. So the campuses, I think, need to come up with those kinds of decisions. Unfortunately, I think most of them don't have a strong enough view of what damage could be done on their campuses with just their local unsworn officers, no guns, nothing on their campuses. I think they are sort of living in an ivory tower when it comes to dealing with those issues.
So you all heard it here first. If we get Republican majorities, we'll pass the 10 Commandments. Great. Yeah.
Hi, Representative Foxx. I'm Ben Story. I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. I spent most of my professional career on a college campus, and I deeply appreciate your point that a lot of this stuff has been going on for a very long time and just burst into the open. I'd add, I think you would agree with this, that a lot of it actually begins in the curriculum and in the classroom with what's actually being taught in our college and university campuses. You and I might agree that in the best of all possible worlds, there might be less federal funding for education, but it's unlikely that those levels are going to significantly decrease anytime soon. Republicans have been fighting that battle for a long time, not very successfully. Given that reality, given what you've pointed out to us about the university's character as a public trust, given how much money it receives, could some of that money be directed toward improving instruction in the crucial areas that touch on these kinds of issues? Better instruction, for example, in the history of the Middle East, better instruction in American history, better instruction in the principles of political philosophy, for example, through the kinds of grants given by the NEH. Could the federal government use its positive power to fund good things on college campuses to help ameliorate the underlying intellectual climate that gives rise to a lot of these problems?
There is a law that prevents the federal government from being involved in curriculum.
The
So-
federal government funded me to develop certain curricular programs.
You got a grant.
Yeah.
Okay, so in that, I was going to come back to that and say, yes, probably, and that's probably something we really ought to be looking at as to, again, where that money's going. I've heard from people about some of the funding in certain programs, not a lot of money, but being very slanted against Jewish people. I can't remember now the exact program, but as I said, it's not a lot of money that's going that way. But to have a real impact, I think people are going to have to start voting with their feet. I've said that for a long time. I think that people have to be a lot more discerning about what's happening on the campuses. And again, one of the things I hope that will happen as a result of these awful things that have happened is that people will say, I'm not sending my children to one of those schools. Or students are going to say, it's not worth it to go. I think their prestige has been shot all to hell, if you want to just to be blunt about it. And sure, there'll still be people who will want to go for the prestige of the grant, of the degree, the name. But I do think we're going to see a major change occur. Now, what we're doing with the College Cost Reduction Act, again, is we're going to be looking at program by program and trying to make it clear to parents and students what the return on their investment is going to be as a result of that. And we'll be asking all schools to be participating in that. And I think the more transparency we have, the more accountability we bring to programs, the better decisions will be made by people. So sure, NEH and a lot of the programs, I mean, but it's not just in the education department either. I mean, there are so many grant programs that are out there all over the federal government. There are over 200 STEM programs. 200 STEM grant programs across the federal government. They're in just about every department. So one of the things we need to do would be to consolidate areas to start with to begin to get a handle, because that's one of the big problems in the federal government is that there's so much money spread out over so many departments. When you try to create accountability and reporting, it's just gargantuan, and members of Congress just don't have time to do all that. And when you have departments like this department, there's no willingness to do it. So it's a big issue. I'm not as pessimistic about bringing down the size of the federal government as it relates to education as you are, because I think maybe financial aid will be a tough thing to really cut back on. But I think in terms of funding programs, we might be able to do more as a result of what's happened. And as I said, it makes me very sad to see that it would take these demonstrations, these riots, and all of this to bring attention to how rotten post-secondary education is, but it's going to have a positive impact long-term.
Great. And that's, I think, all the time that we have today. So
Okay.
on behalf of AEI, on behalf of American Jewry, on behalf of, I think, the vast majority of American citizens, I want to thank you,
Max.
for all the work that you've done, and thanks for coming today. And thank you all for coming as well. And if you could just remain seated while the chairwoman and I leave, and then you are all free to go about your days.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.